Few American dynasties have courted destruction quite like the princes of Michigan. Once revered as the pious architects of the Christian right and titans of the automotive industry, the family gambled their immense fortune on a radical new commodity: private warfare. It was a wager that ended in moral bankruptcy. From the executive suites of Holland, Michigan to the carnage of Nisour Square, the Prince name evolved from a symbol of industrial success into a global brand for impunity and slaughter. Yet while their reputation lies in ruins, their terrifying innovation endured. By shattering the state's monopoly on violence, they didn't just lose a company, they unleashed a new era where armies answer not to a flag, but to a paycheck. The dynasty may be broken, but the shadow world they built has become the modern global standard. From sun visors to Navy SEALs. The origins of Blackwater, the world's most notorious private army, are not found in the Pentagon or the CIA, but in the quiet, snow-covered town of Holland, Michigan. This small, deeply religious community on the shores of Lake Macatawa was the cradle of the Prince family dynasty. It was here that Edgar Prince, the family patriarch, built the engine of wealth that would one day fuel his son's global ambitions. Edgar was a man of the post-war American boom, an engineer with a relentless work ethic and a devout Calvinist faith. In 1965, he left his job at a local machine shop to start his own business, the Prince Corporation. He began with practically nothing, a few machines in a rented garage, but he possessed a singular genius for identifying the small, overlooked inconveniences of daily life and engineering profitable solutions for them. Edgar's breakthrough came from a simple observation. The sun visors in cars were flimsy and useless for anything other than blocking glare. He engineered a lighted vanity mirror that could be embedded directly into the visor. It was a small innovation, but when he sold the idea to General Motors, it revolutionized the automotive interior market. The lighted visor became a standard feature in nearly every American car, and the Prince Corporation exploded. Edgar didn't stop there. He invented the programmable garage door opener, the digital compass, and the overhead console. By the 1980s, his company was the largest employer in Holland, Michigan, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue annually. The Prince family became royalty in Western Michigan, their name synonymous with industrial success and philanthropy. But the Princes were not typical billionaires. They were the bedrock of the Christian right. Edgar and his wife Elsa were deeply committed to a worldview that fused free market capitalism with evangelical Christianity. They were not just donors, they were architects of the modern conservative movement. They poured millions of dollars into organizations like the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family, groups dedicated to opposing abortion and gay rights. Their home became a salon for the titans of the Republican Party. Figures like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were not just political leaders to the Princes, they were house guests. It was into this atmosphere of extreme wealth, fervent religion, and high-stakes politics that Eric Prince was born on June the 6th, 1969. He was the youngest of 4 children and the only son, the heir apparent to the industrial kingdom. From birth, Eric was different. While his older sisters, including Betsy, who would later marry Dick DeVos, heir to the Amway fortune, and become Donald Trump's Secretary of Education, were groomed for leadership within the family's philanthropic and political circles, Eric was drawn to the martial. He grew up steeped in a culture that revered the military and viewed the world as a battlefield between the forces of righteousness, America and Christianity, and the forces of darkness, communism and secularism. As a boy, Eric was obsessed with war. He devoured books on military history, collected weapons, and idolized the rugged individualism of figures like Oliver North. Edgar Prince indulged his son's fascinations, taking him on trips that were far removed from the country clubs of Michigan. They traveled to Berlin to see the wall, to the Dachau concentration camp to witness the evidence of evil, and, most significantly, to the Soviet Union. These trips were not vacations. They were educational pilgrimages designed to instill in Eric a visceral hatred of totalitarianism and a belief in the absolute moral superiority of the West. Eric's path seemed destined for the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, which he attended for 3 semesters. However, chafing under the rigid bureaucratic discipline of the academy, which he viewed as stifling and overly concerned with polish rather than warfare, he transferred to Hillsdale College, a small, conservative liberal arts school in Michigan known for its rejection of federal funding and its adherence to free market principles. While at Hillsdale, he engaged in his first deployment, not with the military, but as a volunteer firefighter and a diver for the local sheriff's department. He also interned in Washington, D.C. for George H.W. Bush's White House and for Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, a staunch anti-communist. It was during this time that Prince reportedly joined a search team in Nicaragua, hunting for mass graves to expose the crimes of the socialist Sandinista government, an experience that cemented his view of himself as a warrior in a global ideological struggle. In 1992, after graduating from Hillsdale, Prince commissioned as an officer in the United States Navy, but he didn't want to be a fleet officer. He wanted to be the tip of the spear. He entered basic underwater demolition /SEAL training, BUD/S, the most grueling military training program in the world. Prince thrived in the punishment. He graduated and deployed with SEAL Team 8 to Haiti, the Middle East, and the Balkans. The SEAL teams were Prince's spiritual home. They validated everything he believed about the world, that elite, highly trained units operating in the shadows could achieve strategic results that massive lumbering armies could not. He absorbed the SEAL ethos of unconventional warfare, speed, and aggression. He saw firsthand the limitations of the conventional U.S. military, the slow logistics, the risk-averse leadership, the bloated bureaucracy. He began to formulate a theory: the private sector, unencumbered by red tape, could do the job of war better, faster, and cheaper. However, his military career was cut short by tragedy. In 1995, Edgar Prince collapsed from a massive heart attack in the elevator of his own office building. He died at the age of 63. The patriarch was gone, and the Prince Corporation, the family's golden goose, was suddenly leaderless. Eric, then 25 and deployed in Bosnia, left the Navy early to return home. He and his family faced a critical decision. The automotive industry was consolidating, and without Edgar's visionary leadership, the company's future was uncertain. In 1996, in a move that would alter the trajectory of Eric's life, the family sold the Prince Corporation to Johnson Controls for $1.35 billion in cash. Eric Prince's share of the sale was substantial, estimated at around $500 million. He was 27 years old, a former Navy SEAL with $500 million in the bank, and a burning desire to remain in the world of special operations. He had no interest in becoming a philanthropist or a politician like his sister Betsy. He wanted to build something that reflected his own martial identity. He looked at the state of the U.S. military in the late 1990s. The Cold War was over. The Clinton administration was slashing defense budgets, closing bases, and cutting troop numbers. The peace dividend was in full swing. But Prince saw a dangerous gap opening up. The world was not getting safer. It was getting more chaotic. Failed states, terrorism, and asymmetric warfare were on the rise. Yet the U.S. military was shrinking. Training facilities were overcrowded and outdated. Special operations forces were overstretched. Prince saw a market opportunity that no one else saw. He would build a private training facility for the military elite. He would create a Disney World for shooters, a place where SEALs, Delta Force, and SWAT teams could train without the bureaucratic restrictions of government ranges. In 1997, using a portion of his inheritance, Prince purchased 6,000 acres of the Great Dismal Swamp in Moyock, North Carolina, just south of the Virginia border. The land was cheap, isolated, and perfect for his needs. He began to pour money into the swamp. He drained the peat bogs, built world-class shooting ranges, constructed driving tracks, and erected mock cities for urban warfare training. He hired his old friends from the SEAL teams as instructors. He called the company Blackwater, named after the dark, peat-stained water of the swamp he had conquered. At its inception, Blackwater was not a mercenary army. It was a high-end service provider, a niche business catering to the training needs of the U.S. military and law enforcement. Its first contracts were modest, renting out ranges to SEAL teams who couldn't get time on Navy facilities, training local police SWAT teams. The revenue was negligible compared to the Prince family fortune. But Eric didn't care. He was back in the game. He was building a capability. But Prince's vision was already expanding beyond simple training. He was watching the genocide in Rwanda and the chaos in the Balkans, and he was disgusted by the inaction of the United Nations and the Western powers. He began to articulate a radical idea. If the UN wouldn't send peacekeepers, why couldn't a private company do it? Why couldn't a private Peace Corps, armed and trained to Western standards, stop a genocide for a fraction of the cost of a UN deployment? This was the seed of the mercenary empire. Prince wasn't just building a shooting range. He was building a private military capability in waiting. He was assembling a Rolodex of the world's most lethal operators, men who, like him, felt constrained by the rules of conventional militaries. He was creating a turnkey solution for violence. As the 1990s came to a close, Blackwater was a small, respected, but largely unknown entity in the defense world. It was a rich man's hobby, a training camp in a swamp. But history was about to intervene. The geopolitical tectonic plates were shifting. The era of the peace dividend was about to end in a fireball, and the United States government was about to find itself in desperate need of exactly the kind of privatized lethal force that Eric Prince was preparing to sell. The patriarch Edgar had built an empire on car parts. His son was about to build one on war. Blackwater was the martial evolution of the Prince family ethos. The rigid Calvinist discipline that ruled Edgar Prince's dinner table was simply transplanted to the barracks of the North Carolina swamp. Eric Prince did not just inherit a bank account, he inherited a crusade. The billions generated by the Prince Corporation were never treated as mere wealth, but as fuel for a specific radical vision of Christian governance. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the family business had a dual output. On the factory floor, they were stamping out sun visors for General Motors, but in the shadows, they were manufacturing a movement. Edgar Prince was a key figure in the Council for National Policy, CNP, a secretive networking group for the wealthiest and most influential social conservatives in America. It was a place where right-wing donors, televangelists, and Republican strategists plotted the culture war. Eric grew up in this milieu. He didn't just learn about free markets, he absorbed the tenets of dominionism, the belief that Christians have a mandate from God to occupy all secular institutions, including the government and the military, until Christ returns. This theological backdrop is essential to understanding the DNA of Blackwater. When Eric Prince founded the company in 1997, he did not view it simply as a service provider. In his mind, and in the minds of the close circle of executives he hired, many of whom were fellow conservative Catholics and former military officers, Blackwater was a patriotic project. It was designed to be a bulwark of Western civilization, a private instrument that could act where the secular, bureaucratic, and weak Clinton administration would not. This crusader mentality was reinforced by his brief but transformative time in the Navy SEALs. In the SEAL teams, Prince found a brotherhood that mirrored his religious convictions, a binary world of good versus evil, where violence was a redemptive tool used to protect the innocent. However, he also witnessed what he perceived as the moral decay of the conventional military. He despised the political correctness that he felt was creeping into the armed forces, the inclusion of women in combat roles, the focus on peacekeeping over warfighting, and the cumbersome rules of engagement. When he left the Navy in 1996, Prince carried this grievance with him. He wanted to preserve the pure warrior ethos he had found in the SEALs, but without the government oversight. He wanted to create a sanctuary for the Spartans. This is why the Moyock facility was built with such lavish attention to detail. It wasn't just a business decision. It was an act of homage. He built the training grounds that he wished the Navy had provided him. He imported the best weaponry, the best instructors, and the best technology, creating a private meritocracy where the only currency was lethality. The initial business plan for Blackwater in 1997 to 1998 reflected this purest vision. It was not yet about guarding diplomats in Iraq. It was about fixing the broken training pipeline of American law enforcement and military. Prince saw that local police SWAT teams were outgunned by drug dealers. He saw that Navy sailors were unprepared for urban combat. Blackwater was pitched as the solution to the degradation of American readiness. However, the company's location and structure also hinted at a darker utility. By setting up in the remote swamps of North Carolina, far from the prying eyes of Washington or the press, Prince created a deniable space. It was a private fiefdom where the normal rules of civilian life did not apply. The local authorities in Currituck County were charmed by the influx of jobs and the Prince family's philanthropy, granting the company wide latitude in zoning and operations. Blackwater became, in effect, a sovereign entity from day one, operating under its own flag and its own rules. The funding for this enterprise was entirely derived from the sale of the Prince Corporation. This is a critical historical detail. The money that built the world's most dangerous private army came directly from the pockets of American car buyers. Every time a consumer bought a GM or Chrysler car in the 1990s with a lighted vanity mirror, they were unwittingly contributing fractions of a cent to the war chest that would eventually destabilize the Middle East. By the end of 1997, the foundation was complete. Eric Prince had the money from his father, the ideology from the Christian right, the network from the Council for National Policy, and the tactical know-how from the SEALs. He had built the machine. He had created a private capability that rivaled that of many small nations. All he lacked was a war. He would not have to wait long. The geopolitical vacuum of the post-Cold War era was filling with new asymmetric threats, and the U.S. government was about to realize that it had hollowed out its own military just when it needed it most. The stage was set for the collision of Prince's supply and America's demand. The golden age of the mercenary. For the first few years of its existence, Blackwater USA was a solution aggressively searching for a problem. The Moyock facility, carved out of the North Carolina swamp in 1997, was an engineering marvel, a state-of-the-art playground for shooters featuring the world's largest private armory, mock urban environments, and driving tracks. But it was a financial black hole. Eric Prince had poured millions of his automotive inheritance into the infrastructure, betting on a future that had not yet arrived. The peace dividend of the Clinton era meant that military budgets remained tight, and the political appetite for outsourcing lethal force was non-existent. Blackwater was essentially a high-end curiosity, a boutique training center where local SWAT teams and the occasional SEAL platoon came to sharpen their skills on their own dime. Prince, restless and ambitious, believed in the inevitability of global chaos. But as the new millennium dawned, the world seemed frustratingly stable for a man selling a private army. The first fracture in the geopolitical ice appeared in October 2000 with the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. Al-Qaeda suicide bombers in a small fiberglass boat had managed to approach a $1 billion U.S. destroyer and blow a hole in its hull, killing 17 sailors. The attack revealed a glaring asymmetric weakness in the U.S. Navy's capabilities. Its sailors were masters of open ocean warfare, but they were woefully unprepared for force protection, the gritty business of defending a ship against small arms threats in a crowded harbor. Prince seized the moment with the instincts of the entrepreneur he was raised to be. He pitched the Navy a rapid solution. Blackwater would build a mock ship in its swamp, complete with steel hulls and water targets, and train sailors specifically on how to shoot small boats out of the water. The Navy, desperate for a quick fix that didn't involve the bureaucracy of building its own infrastructure, agreed. It was Blackwater's first significant government contract, proving Prince's core thesis that the private sector could move faster than the Pentagon, but it was still just a training contract. Prince wanted to be in the fight. Then came the morning of September 11, 2001. As the Twin Towers fell, Eric Prince understood immediately that the world had violently aligned with his vision. The peace dividend was incinerated in the fireball of the World Trade Center. The United States was about to embark on a global borderless war on terror, a conflict that would require a massive surge in manpower, intelligence, and specialized violence. The U.S. military, hollowed out by a decade of budget cuts, was not ready for this new reality. It was too slow, too heavy, and too regulated. The CIA, which had been stripped of its paramilitary capabilities in the 1990s, was equally unprepared for a shadow war in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. Prince did not wait for the phone to ring. In the chaotic days following the attacks, he drove his SUV straight to Washington, D.C. He did not go to the Pentagon recruitment office. He went to the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia. Prince had a significant advantage. His father, Edgar, had been a major Republican donor, and Eric had cultivated deep ties within the conservative intelligence establishment. He secured a meeting with Alvin Buzzy Krongard, the executive director of the CIA. Krongard was the number 3 man at the agency, and he was desperate for solutions. The CIA was preparing to invade Afghanistan to hunt bin Laden, but they lacked the shooters, the highly trained paramilitary operators who could protect case officers in the field. Prince made Krongard an offer that would change the history of modern warfare. He told him that Blackwater was not just a training range, it was a private army in waiting. He had a database of thousands of former SEALs, Delta Force operators, and Special Forces soldiers. He could vet them, equip them, and deploy them faster than the military could mobilize a single platoon. He offered the CIA a turnkey security solution. Krongard accepted. In early 2002, Blackwater received a secret no-bid contract worth $5.4 million to provide a 20-man security detail for the CIA station in Kabul. This was the crossing of the Rubicon. Blackwater was no longer a training company. It was a private military contractor, PMC, operating in a combat zone. The men Prince deployed to Kabul were not soldiers in the legal sense. They were civilians, paid by a corporation, armed with weapons technically owned by the U.S. government, operating in a legal gray zone where the Uniform Code of Military Justice did not apply. The mission in Kabul was a resounding success. The Blackwater operators, looking like RoboCops in their Oakley sunglasses, beards, and modified carbines, provided a level of aggression and flexibility that the agency loved. They were unburdened by the rules of engagement that constrained the uniformed military, and they were loyal only to the contract. Impressed by their performance, the U.S. government decided to entrust Blackwater with an even more sensitive mission later in 2002. The Pentagon and State Department were struggling to keep Hamid Karzai, the newly installed president of Afghanistan, alive. Karzai had survived multiple assassination attempts, and the U.S. military's Delta Force had been protecting him, but the Pentagon wanted its elite soldiers back for hunting terrorists, not babysitting a politician. They turned to Blackwater. In a historic move, the United States government outsourced the personal security of a foreign head of state to a private company. Blackwater guards became Karzai's shadow, sleeping in the presidential palace, vetting his visitors, and driving his convoy. They were the Praetorian Guard of the new Afghanistan. For Eric Prince, this was the ultimate validation. His private employees were doing a job that was once the exclusive preserve of the U.S. military's most elite unit, and they were doing it for a profit. The contract legitimized the industry. Suddenly, mercenary was no longer a dirty word. It was a security contractor, a vital component of national defense. But Afghanistan was just the prologue. The main event, the conflict that would turn Blackwater into a household name and a billion-dollar empire, was Iraq. When the United States invaded Iraq in March 2003, it broke the country. The rapid military victory was followed by a catastrophic failure of planning. The Iraqi army was disbanded, the police force collapsed, and the country descended into looting and insurgency. The U.S. military, with only 150,000 troops on the ground, was woefully undermanned to secure the country. They could barely protect themselves, let alone the thousands of diplomats, engineers, and bureaucrats who were flooding into Baghdad to rebuild the nation. Into this security vacuum stepped L. Paul Bremer. Bremer was appointed by President Bush as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, effectively the Viceroy of Iraq. He was the most important man in the country, a target for every insurgent group in the Middle East. He needed protection, but the military was overstretched. In August 2003, the State Department awarded Blackwater a $27 million no-bid contract to provide personal security for Paul Bremer. This contract changed everything. It moved Blackwater from the shadows of covert CIA ops into the blinding spotlight of the occupation. Overnight, Blackwater became the face of the American presence in Baghdad. The image of Paul Bremer, dressed in a suit and combat boots, striding through Baghdad surrounded by a phalanx of burly Blackwater guards, became the defining visual of the era. These guards were not subtle. They drove massive armored SUVs. They wore tactical gear but no rank insignia. They pointed machine guns at Iraqi civilians to clear traffic. They were the men in green, operating with an air of total impunity. Under the terms of their contract, and later under CPA Order 17, a law signed by Bremer himself just days before he left Iraq, Blackwater contractors were granted immunity from Iraqi law. They could not be arrested by Iraqi police. They could not be tried In Iraqi courts, they were untouchable. This legal immunity bred a culture of aggression. Blackwater operators, paid up to $600 a day, 6 times what a U.S. Army sergeant made, viewed their mission in stark terms. The principle must survive at all costs. The lives of Iraqis were secondary. They drove aggressively, famously ramming Iraqi cars that got too close to their convoys. They threw water bottles and frozen Gatorade at other vehicles to clear the road. They adopted a shoot-first mentality. To the U.S. government, Blackwater was indispensable because they kept the VIPs alive. Not a single American diplomat under Blackwater protection was killed during this period. Prince touted this statistic constantly. But to the Iraqi people, Blackwater was a symbol of arrogance and occupation, a death squad roaming their streets in SUVs, answerable to no one. The ambush in Fallujah in March 2004 was a gruesome tragedy, but for Blackwater it was also a marketing opportunity. It allowed Eric Prince to argue that his men were under-equipped for the war they were fighting. Just days later, on April 4, 2004, the company would prove exactly how ready it was for combat in an engagement that is often cited as the turning point for the entire industry, the Battle of Najaf. On that Sunday morning, the holy city of Najaf exploded into violence. The Mahdi army, a Shia militia loyal to cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, launched a massive coordinated assault on the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA compound. The compound was defended by a handful of U.S. Marines, some Salvadoran soldiers, and 8 Blackwater contractors. When the attack began, the overwhelming numbers of the militia threatened to overrun the facility. In the chaos, the lines of command blurred. The Blackwater contractors, mostly former SEALs with decades of combat experience, effectively took tactical command of the defense. They took up positions on the roof of the CPA building and engaged in a relentless hours-long firefight. As the battle raged and ammunition ran low, Blackwater did something no private company had ever done before. It deployed its own air support. The company dispatched its own MD-530 Little Bird helicopters from Baghdad to resupply the defenders on the roof. These small, agile helicopters, flown by Blackwater pilots, flew through a hail of enemy fire to drop crates of ammo and evacuate the wounded. During the battle, videos surfaced of Blackwater snipers on the roof, calmly picking off targets while communicating on radios with the same professional detachment as a Tier 1 military unit. The defense of Najaf was a tactical masterpiece. The compound held, but it also crossed a red line. Private citizens, paid by a corporation, had engaged in a sustained high-intensity battle, commanded U.S. and coalition troops, and utilized private air power to kill insurgents. The distinction between security guard and soldier had evaporated. Following Najaf, Blackwater's aviation division, Presidential Airways, exploded in size. Prince bought a fleet of CASA 212 transport planes and Super Tucano light attack aircraft. But the most visible symbol of Blackwater's dominance in Iraq became the Little Bird. These helicopters, often with Blackwater shooters hanging out the sides armed with M4 carbines and belt-fed machine guns, became a fixture of the Baghdad sky. They flew top cover for the diplomatic convoys below. However, their tactics were terrifyingly aggressive. To clear traffic for the VIPs, the helicopters would fly dangerously low, buzzing Iraqi cars and pedestrians. If a vehicle didn't stop fast enough, the door gunners would fire warning shots into the hood or the engine block. This was the shoot-first culture that permeated the company. Blackwater operators were not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. They operated in a legal vacuum. If a Blackwater guard shot an Iraqi civilian, there was no MP to arrest him, no JAG officer to investigate him, and no Iraqi court with jurisdiction to try him. The only penalty was getting fired, window-seated on a plane, back to the U.S. This impunity bred a culture of recklessness. Internet videos began to circulate, set to heavy metal music, showing Blackwater convoys ramming Iraqi cars, running civilians off the road, and firing indiscriminately into traffic to keep the lanes open. One infamous operator, known by the call sign Elvis, was emblematic of this era. He was eventually fired for aggressive behavior, but not before becoming a symbol of the cowboy mentality that Prince's company encouraged. Prince himself fueled this culture, referring to his employees as patriots, doing the dirty work that the politically correct military refused to do. He insulated them with the best lawyers and the best gear, creating a loyalty that bordered on a cult. By 2006, Blackwater was virtually a fourth branch of the U.S. military in Iraq. They had their own base in the Green Zone, their own intelligence network, and their own logistics train. They were the Praetorian Guard for the entire U.S. diplomatic mission. The State Department was completely dependent on them. American diplomats could not move a single inch outside the Green Zone without a Blackwater detail. This dependency gave Prince enormous leverage. He could charge premium rates, and the government paid without question. The burn rate was astronomical. Blackwater was billing the U.S. government roughly $1,222 per day for a single protective security specialist. The company's footprint also expanded domestically. Leveraging the connections of the Prince family, Blackwater secured lucrative contracts with the Department of Homeland Security and began training local law enforcement agencies across the United States. The facility in Moyoc grew to 7,000 acres, adding a private airstrip and a manufacturing plant where Prince built his own armored personnel carriers, the Grizzly. He was building a vertically integrated war machine. Yet as 2006 drew to a close, the cracks in the facade were becoming impossible to ignore. The resentment among the Iraqi population was at a boiling point. To the average Iraqi, Blackwater was not a security firm. They were assassins who owned the road. The U.S. military commanders, too, were growing furious. They complained that Blackwater's shoot-and-scoot tactics were counterinsurgency nightmares. A Blackwater convoy would race through a village, shoot up a car that got too close, and speed away, leaving the U.S. Marines who patrolled that area to deal with the angry, grieving locals. General Peter Chiarelli, the commander of the multinational corps in Iraq, famously commented that every time they go out, they create new insurgents. But in Washington, under the Bush administration, Blackwater was untouchable. Eric Prince's political donations and his sister Betsy DeVos's influence within the Republican Party provided a political heat shield. The State Department renewed their contracts again and again. The profits continued to pour into the Prince family accounts, fueling the expansion of an empire that now seemed too big to fail and too connected to regulate. As the sun set on 2006, Blackwater USA was the most successful private military company in history. It had survived Fallujah, triumphed in Najaf, and profited from the chaos of the occupation. But the laws of probability were catching up with them. You cannot run a private army with zero accountability in a war zone forever. The aggression that had been their selling point was about to become their undoing. The golden age was over. The reckoning was waiting in a crowded traffic circle in Baghdad called Nisour Square. As the sun rose on 2007, the atmosphere in Baghdad shifted from chaotic to apocalyptic. President George W. Bush announced the surge, deploying 20,000 additional American troops into the meat grinder of the Iraqi Civil War. For Blackwater, This escalation meant business was booming, but the risks were becoming existential. The insurgency had evolved. They were no longer facing ragtag militias. They were facing sophisticated snipers, advanced IEDs, and teams dedicated to hunting private contractors. The golden age of easy money was over. The era of the kill zone had begun. The psychological breaking point for the company came early in the year, on January 23, 2007. On that afternoon, a Blackwater Little Bird helicopter, call sign Blackwater 61, was flying a routine diplomatic protection route over Sunni-controlled central Baghdad. The pilots, Art Laguna and Shane Schmidt, along with door gunners carrying M4s, were flying low and fast, the company's trademark profile. Suddenly, heavy machine gun fire erupted from the rooftops below. A round pierced the fuselage, striking the pilot. The helicopter shuddered and crashed into a narrow, hostile alleyway in the Fadil neighborhood. All 5 men on board were killed, some by the crash, others executed by insurgents who swarmed the wreckage. This was a catastrophic blow. Blackwater had lost men before. The Fallujah 4 in 2004, the IED strikes in 2005. But they had never lost an aircraft to enemy fire. The company's aura of invincibility, the belief that their superior technology and speed made them untouchable, was shattered in a smoking pile of metal. The reaction from Blackwater Command in the Green Zone was one of fury. In the weeks and months that followed the shootdown, the company's tactics on the ground shifted from aggressive to hyper-violent. A siege mentality took hold. Every Iraqi vehicle was viewed as a car bomb. Every pedestrian was a potential spotter. The rules of engagement, which were already loose, effectively evaporated. Throughout the spring and summer of 2007, Blackwater teams were involved in a series of high-profile shooting incidents that terrorized the city but were largely hushed up by the State Department. In May 2007, a Blackwater convoy driving near the Iraqi Interior Ministry got into a heated standoff with Iraqi police commandos. Guns were drawn. Blackwater operators, refusing to back down to locals, disarmed the Iraqi police at gunpoint, humiliating the host nation's security forces in broad daylight. It was a diplomatic disaster, proving that the private army had more power than the state itself. Days later, another incident occurred that foreshadowed the looming tragedy. A Blackwater sniper positioned on the roof of the Justice Ministry shot and killed an Iraqi driver whom he claimed was driving suspiciously near the compound. An investigation revealed the driver was simply lost. The State Department official in charge of oversight, known as the Regional Security Officer, RSO, initially tried to discipline the shooter, but Blackwater's influence in Washington was so potent that the RSO was reportedly told to back off. The shooter was quietly flown home, facing no charges. The message to the men on the ground was clear: keep the principal alive and the company will bury the bodies. By August 2007, the operational tempo was unsustainable. Blackwater operators were running multiple missions a day in 120-degree heat, fueled by caffeine, steroids, which were reportedly rampant in the contracting world, and a constant adrenaline-soaked fear. They were exhausted. They felt abandoned by the military, hated by the Iraqis, and protected only by their own firepower. The company's footprint had now expanded to nearly 1,000 operators in Iraq alone. Eric Prince, operating from the safety of Virginia, continued to push for more. He testified before Congress, painting a picture of a disciplined, heroic force. But the reality on the ground was a fraying wire. The Wolf Pack, the nickname for the tactical support teams, was off the leash. They were rolling through Baghdad with heavy machine guns, armored Bearcats, and a belief that they were the lords of the city. As September 2007 dawned, the tension in Baghdad was palpable. The insurgency was pushing back against the surge with waves of suicide bombings. The U.S. Embassy was on high alert. Blackwater teams were briefed that complex attacks against convoys were imminent. The paranoia was absolute. The men were primed for a fight. They were waiting for a spark. That spark would come on a Sunday afternoon in a busy traffic circle in the Mansour district. The rise of Blackwater was complete. The machinery of violence was fully assembled, funded, and deployed. Now, it was about to malfunction in the most horrific way possible. The empire that Eric Prince had built on the promise of security was about to become the primary source of terror. The massacre at Nisour Square. On the morning of Sunday, September 16, 2007, the city of Baghdad was sweltering under a midday sun that pushed temperatures past 100 degrees. The atmosphere in the Green Zone, the fortified American citadel in the center of the city, was electric with tension. Earlier that morning, a massive car bomb had detonated near the jagged concrete blast walls of the compound, sending a plume of black smoke into the sky and putting every security detail on high alert. For the men of Blackwater's tactical support team, Raven 23, the explosion was a call to action. They were the heavy hitters, the rapid response force equipped with the heaviest armor and the biggest guns, designed to rescue other diplomatic convoys if they came under fire. Raven 23 rolled out of the Green Zone gates in a convoy of 4 massive armored Bearcat vehicles, mounting M240 machine guns and turrets. Their mission was ostensibly defensive. They were to set up a blockade at a traffic circle to secure a route for a U.S. State Department official who was being evacuated from the bomb site. However, the team was already operating on a hair trigger. They had ignored a direct order from the Blackwater Watch Command to stay put. The team leader, a man named Paul Slow, had radioed that they were moving out regardless. This act of insubordination was characteristic of the cowboy culture that had metastasized within the company. They believed they knew better than the dispatchers in the Tactical Operations Center. At approximately 12:08 p.m., the convoy entered Nisour Square, a busy, chaotic traffic circle in the affluent Mansour district. The square was crowded with Iraqi civilian traffic, families running errands, taxi drivers, and commuters. As the 4 armored behemoths muscled their way into the intersection, stopping traffic in all directions to create a security bubble, the mood shifted instantly from routine congestion to lethal panic. The focus of the tragedy that followed was a white Kia sedan. Inside were a young medical student named Ahmed Haitham and his mother Mahassin. They were driving to a hospital where Ahmed's father worked as a pathologist. As the Blackwater convoy blocked the road, Ahmed slowed his car, but perhaps confused by the hand signals or simply caught in the flow of traffic, the vehicle rolled slightly forward. To the turret gunner in the lead Blackwater vehicle, a former Marine named Nicholas Slatton, this movement was not a traffic error. It was a threat. In the paranoid calculus of 2007 Baghdad, a white sedan moving toward a convoy was a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, VBIED. Slatton did not fire a warning shot. He raised his sniper rifle and fired directly through the windshield, striking Ahmed Haitham in the head. Ahmed died instantly. His foot, dead weight on the accelerator, slipped off the brake. The white Kia, now carrying a corpse and a screaming mother, lurched forward, picking up speed toward the convoy. This was the spark that ignited the massacre. Seeing the car accelerate, the other gunners of Raven 23 opened up with everything they had. They unleashed a wall of lead from their belt-fed machine guns. They didn't just shoot the driver, they shredded the car. Mahassin, clutching her dead son, was disintegrated by the gunfire. The car exploded in flames, not from a bomb, but from the sheer volume of kinetic energy tearing it apart. But the shooting didn't stop with the Kia. The operators of Raven 23, gripped by a contagion of panic and aggression, began to fire in a 360-degree arc. They fired into the line of stopped cars behind the Kia. They fired at a bus. They fired at people trying to flee their vehicles. They fired M203 grenade launchers into the intersection, an act of overwhelming force usually reserved for pitched military battles, not traffic control. For the next 15 minutes, Nisour Square became a kill box. Iraqi civilians trapped in their cars were cut to pieces. A taxi driver was killed while trying to surrender. A father shielding his infant child was shot. People crawling on the asphalt to escape the inferno were targeted. The Iraqi police officers stationed in the traffic circle, who tried to signal that there were no insurgents, were engaged by the Blackwater gunners as enemy combatants. When the shooting finally stopped, 17 Iraqi civilians lay dead, and 20 were critically wounded. Among the dead were 2 children. The white Kia had been reduced to a smoking skeleton. The pavement was slick with blood and covered in shattered glass and spent brass casings. Raven 23, believing they had just repelled a complex ambush, popped smoke grenades to cover their withdrawal and sped back to the green zone. They radioed in a contact report, claiming they had been engaged by small arms fire and had eliminated the threats. But as the smoke cleared in Nisour Square, the silence was broken by the wails of the survivors and the arrival of Iraqi investigators. They found something that would destroy Blackwater's narrative. There were no weapons in the civilian cars. There were no shell casings from insurgent AK-47s. The only brass on the ground belonged to American-made ammunition. The victims were not terrorists. They were doctors, students, and children. The news of the massacre hit Baghdad like a shockwave. For years, the Iraqis had endured the arrogance of the private contractors, the aggressive driving, and the random shootings. But this was different. This was slaughter in broad daylight. The Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, famously weak and beholden to the Americans, was forced to act by the sheer scale of the public outrage. He called the killings a crime and demanded justice. Within 24 hours, the Iraqi government announced that it was revoking Blackwater's license to operate in the country. Back in the United States, the news broke slowly, filtered through the confusion of the war zone. Blackwater's initial press statements were defiant. They stuck to the story that Raven 23 had been ambushed by armed insurgents and had acted heroically to defend American lives. Eric Prince, from his headquarters in Moyoc, supported his men unconditionally. He believed the fog of war would protect them, but the fog was lifting. The U.S. military, which had arrived at the scene shortly after Raven 23 fled, conducted an initial assessment. Their report, sent up the chain of command to General David Petraeus, was blunt. There was no evidence of an enemy attack. It appeared to be a case of unprovoked negligence. This military report was the first crack in the dam. The State Department, terrified of losing its protectors, tried to shield Blackwater. They offered the operators of Raven 23 limited immunity in exchange for their statements, a botched legal maneuver that would complicate the prosecution for years. But the FBI was eventually called in. When FBI agents arrived in Baghdad later in 2007 to investigate, they were appalled by what they found. They interviewed witnesses, examined the wreckage, and collected the physical evidence. They found that Raven 23 had fired indiscriminately into fleeing traffic. They found that Nicholas Slatton, the sniper who fired the first shot, had reportedly told teammates earlier that he wanted to kill as many Iraqis as he could as payback for 9/11. The FBI investigation concluded that of the 17 killings, At least 14 were completely unjustified under the rules of engagement. It was not a battle, it was a murder scene. For Eric Prince, the Nisour Square massacre was the beginning of the end. The cloak of secrecy he had carefully maintained was ripped away. On October 2nd, 2007, he was summoned to appear before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. It was a spectacle the world had never seen. The secretive billionaire warlord, forced to sit at a small witness table under the glare of television lights. Prince, with his boyish haircut and expensive suit, did not look like a mercenary. He looked like a CEO, but his testimony was defiant. He refused to apologize. He argued that his men were patriots working in a war zone, subject to split-second decisions that politicians in air-conditioned rooms could not understand. I believe we acted appropriately at all times, Prince told the committee. When asked about the innocent dead, he deflected, blaming the chaotic environment of Iraq. He was calm, icy, and utterly unrepentant. To his supporters on the right, he was a hero being scapegoated by anti-war liberals. To the rest of the world, he was the face of American arrogance, a man who believed his money and his mission placed him above the law. The hearing was a public relations disaster, but the legal consequences were just beginning. The Justice Department, under immense pressure from the Iraqi government and the international community, began to prepare federal charges against the men of Raven 23. The immunity deals offered by the State Department were challenged. The legal battle would drag on for a decade, a tortuous journey through the complexities of extraterritorial law. But for the company itself, the damage was immediate. The brand Blackwater had become toxic. It was now synonymous with child killing. The logo, the bare paw in the crosshairs, was no longer a badge of elite status. It was a mark of shame. The company lost its license to operate in Iraq, though it continued to work for a time under diplomatic loopholes. Contracts were scrutinized. The golden age of the unregulated mercenary was officially over. The massacre at Nisour Square had exposed the fatal flaw in the privatization of war. When you pay men to kill and grant them immunity, you do not get security. You get a massacre. The fallout from Nisour Square did not dissipate with Eric Prince's defiant testimony. It metastasized into a legal and corporate cancer that slowly ate the company alive from the inside out. By 2008, the Department of Justice, under intense pressure from the Iraqi government and the international community, finally moved to indict the men of Raven 23. But the case was a legal minefield. The State Department's initial panicked decision to grant limited immunity to the shooters in exchange for their statements immediately tainted the prosecution. A federal judge later threw out the first indictment, ruling that the prosecutors had improperly used these compelled statements, violating the contractor's constitutional rights against self-incrimination. This legal deadlock enraged the Iraqi public and created a diplomatic nightmare for the Bush administration. It appeared to the world that American mercenaries were literally above the law. To save face, the DOJ was forced to rebuild the case from scratch, hunting for new evidence and witnesses in a war zone that was becoming increasingly hostile. The legal saga of the Blackwater Four, Nicholas Slatton, Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurd, would drag on for nearly a decade, becoming a festering wound in U.S.-Iraq relations. While the lawyers fought in court, the company was fighting for its survival in the marketplace of public opinion. The brand name Blackwater had become radioactive. It was a punchline on late-night talk shows and a rallying cry for anti-war protesters. In a desperate attempt to sanitize the company's image, Eric Prince ordered a total rebranding. In February 2009, Blackwater Worldwide officially changed its name to Z Services LLC, pronounced Z. The rebranding was a cosmetic surgery on a terminal patient. The logo was changed, the website was scrubbed, and the black bear paw print was replaced. But the underlying reality remained. XE was still the same entity, run by the same men, facing the same lawsuits. The media and the public saw through the change immediately. It was interpreted not as a fresh start, but as an admission of guilt, a fugitive changing his name to escape the sheriff. But the true death knell for the original Blackwater Empire came not from a judge, but from its biggest customer. In January 2009, the State Department, under the new Obama administration, announced that it would not renew Blackwater's operating license in Iraq. The Praetorian Guard was fired. The company that had been the face of the American occupation was unceremoniously kicked out of the country. This was an existential financial blow. The Iraq contracts were the company's lifeblood, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Without them, the massive infrastructure Prince had built, the aviation division, the manufacturing plant, the training center, became a crushing overhead liability. Simultaneously, the wall of silence within the company began to crumble. Disgruntled former employees, sensing the ship was sinking, began to talk to the press and to federal investigators. They painted a picture of a company that was not just aggressive, but structurally corrupt. In 2008 and 2009, federal investigators raided the Moyoc headquarters. They weren't looking for evidence of the massacre. They were looking for weapons. A federal investigation revealed that Blackwater had allegedly been involved in a scheme to illegally stockpile automatic weapons. Because private companies are restricted from owning certain types of machine guns, Blackwater had allegedly used the local Camden County Sheriff's Office as a straw buyer, purchasing weapons in the sheriff's name and then keeping them for the company's own use. But the most damaging revelations were personal. Former employees alleged in sworn declarations filed in civil lawsuits that Eric Prince viewed himself as a modern-day crusader. They claimed he had spoken of a desire to eliminate Muslims and that he viewed the company's mission as a holy war. These allegations, though fiercely denied by Prince, reinforced the narrative that Blackwater was a rogue ideological actor, a Christian army operating within the U.S. national security apparatus. By late 2009, Eric Prince realized that he had become the single greatest liability to the company he founded. He was a pariah. The U.S. government, now led by Barack Obama, wanted nothing to do with him. The CIA had canceled its contracts. The State Department had fired him. He was facing millions of dollars in legal fees and the potential for personal criminal exposure over the weapons charges. Prince made a decision that marked the end of an era. In March 2009, he stepped down as CEO of Z Services. But resignation was not enough. The brand could not survive with the Prince family name attached to it. In 2010, he put the entire company up for sale. The sale was the final capitulation. A group of private investors, led by USTC Holdings, bought the company. The price was never officially disclosed, but reports suggested it was a fraction of what the company would have been worth at its peak. The new owners immediately moved to erase every trace of the founder. They renamed the company yet again, this time to Academy, and eventually merged it into a massive corporate conglomerate called Constellis. The Blackwater that had terrified Baghdad was gone, absorbed into the bland corporate anonymity of the global defense industry. For Eric Prince, the sale was an exit strategy, but it was also an exile. He felt betrayed by the country he believed he had served. He argued that he had done exactly what the government asked of him, only to be thrown under the bus when the politics shifted. Bitter, Wealthy and still young, he was only 41, Prince decided to leave the United States entirely. In 2010, he moved his family to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. He chose a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. He left behind the lawsuits, the congressional hearings, and the ruins of his reputation, but he did not leave behind his ambition. He was done with the American government, but he was not done with the business of war. In the deserts of the UAE, free from the constraints of American law and democracy, Erik Prince began to dream of a new kind of army, one that didn't need a national flag at all. The Merchant of Death was setting up a new shop, building secret armies for foreign dictators. The year 2010 marked the beginning of Erik Prince's exile, but it was not a retreat into obscurity. It was a strategic relocation to a jurisdiction where his unique talents were still in high demand and where the constraints of American law could be safely ignored. Having sold the toxic assets of Blackwater, renamed Z Services, and facing a mountain of legal exposure in the United States, Prince moved his family and his operations to Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. He did not choose this location for its climate, but for its politics. The UAE had no extradition treaty with the United States, offered total corporate opacity, and was ruled by an ambitious monarchy flush with oil wealth and deeply suspicious of the Arab Spring that was beginning to destabilize the region. For a man looking to reinvent the mercenary trade away from the prying eyes of Congress and the FBI, it was the perfect sanctuary. Prince arrived in the desert not as a fugitive, but as a visionary consultant. He secured a meeting with Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, MBZ, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, and the de facto ruler of the Emirates. Prince's pitch to the Sheikh was audacious and tailored perfectly to the monarch's fears. He argued that the Emirati military, though lavishly equipped with American hardware, was untested and potentially unreliable in a domestic crisis due to tribal affiliations. What the Sheikh needed, Prince argued, was a force that was loyal to nothing but the paycheck and the crown. He offered to build a secret, private army. This was not a standard security contract for guarding malls or embassies. It was a proposal for a battalion-level military formation capable of special operations. Prince proposed an 800-man foreign legion to ensure absolute loyalty and to avoid the religious and political complications of using Muslim soldiers to kill other Muslims in the event of an uprising. Prince proposed a radical hiring strategy. He would recruit Colombian mercenaries. Colombian soldiers were the ideal candidates. They were battle-hardened from decades of fighting FARC guerrillas and drug cartels in the jungles of South America. They were tough, professional, and crucially, cheap. Prince could hire them for a fraction of the daily rate of an American Navy SEAL. Most importantly, they had no political stake in the Middle East. They would shoot whom they were told to shoot, whether it was an Iranian commando or a rioting guest worker in a Dubai labor camp. The Sheikh agreed to the plan, handing Prince a contract worth an initial $529 million. Operating under the cover of a new opaque holding company called Reflex Responses, R2, Prince set to work. He established a secret training base in the Emirati desert called Zayed Military City, hidden behind high walls and sand dunes. The logistics of this operation, later exposed by the New York Times, were a masterpiece of sanctions-busting creativity. Prince could not legally export American weapons or hire American military trainers for a foreign army without a license from the U.S. State Department. A license he knew he would never get given his pariah status in Washington. So he bypassed America entirely. He hired seasoned South African mercenaries, veterans of the apartheid-era executive outcomes and other private wars to serve as the officers and trainers. He sourced weapons, including mortars, rifles, and Land Rovers, from the global gray market, avoiding U.S. export controls. He flew in hundreds of Colombian soldiers on construction worker visas, confiscated their passports upon arrival to ensure operational security, and handed them uniforms. For 2 years, from 2010 to 2012, Prince built his battalion in the dark. The unit was trained for specific domestic missions, putting down labor riots, conducting counterterrorism raids within the UAE, and, in a worst-case scenario, defending the oil pipelines against sabotage. However, the project eventually hit the friction of reality. Prince had promised the Sheikh a Tier 1 capability, equivalent to U.S. Special Forces, but the Colombian grunts, while brave, lacked the sophisticated skill set of SEALs. Cultural clashes erupted between the South African commanders and the Latin American troops, and inevitably the secret leaked. When the existence of the R2 battalion was revealed in the American press, the Sheikh, embarrassed by the exposure and the potential diplomatic fallout, quietly distanced himself. Prince was gradually pushed out of the project, though the battalion itself remained absorbed into the UAE's military structure as a Praetorian Guard. This setback in the desert did not slow Prince down. It merely redirected his ambition toward a new frontier. By 2012, he had turned his eyes to Africa. The continent was in the midst of a resource boom, fueled by Chinese demand, but it was plagued by the same instability that Prince had always monetized. He saw a market for what he called frontier logistics, a euphemism for militarized supply chains. He founded a new company, Frontier Services Group, FSG, and in a move that stunned the U.S. national security establishment, he listed it on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. This listing was a strategic pivot of immense geopolitical significance. By taking Chinese investment and listing in Hong Kong, Prince was signaling a shift away from the West and toward the rising superpower of the East, China. He began to pitch FSG as a logistics and security provider for China's massive Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. Chinese state-owned companies were pouring billions into mines, dams, and infrastructure in volatile countries like South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were targeted by rebels and kidnappers. They needed protection. Eric Prince, the former American Navy SEAL and CIA asset, was now offering his services to the People's Republic of China. U.S. intelligence officials watched with alarm as FSG bought planes, built airstrips in Kenya and Malta, and began moving men and equipment across the African continent. Prince argued he was just helping businesses operate. But to his critics, he was providing China with a paramilitary capability in Africa, helping a strategic rival secure the mineral resources that would define the 21st century. While playing the great game in Africa, Prince was simultaneously pursuing a separate, highly secretive, and technologically audacious project: the creation of the world's first affordable privatized air force. This venture, codenamed Project Alpha, bridged his time in the UAE and his expansion into Africa. Prince had learned a crucial lesson in Iraq. Helicopters were useful, but expensive and had limited range. He realized that in the forever wars of the developing world, what was needed was a loitering capability, an aircraft that could stay in the air for hours, watch a target, and drop a bomb with precision, all for a fraction of the cost of a U.S. Air Force drone or an F-16. His solution was ingenious and bizarre. He decided to militarize the Thrush 510G, a humble, American-made agricultural crop duster. In a secret hangar in Austria, and later at facilities in the U.S., Prince's engineers began to modify these yellow farm planes. They reinforced the wings to carry hard points for Hellfire missiles and laser-guided bombs. They installed state-of-the-art surveillance balls under the fuselage and armored the cockpits. The result was a counterinsurgency plane in a box, a rugged, terrifyingly effective warplane that looked innocuous on a radar screen but could decimate a rebel camp. Prince pitched this concept to African dictators and the CIA, arguing that he could provide an entire squadron of these air tractors, flown by retired combat pilots, for the price of a single modern jet. As 2015 arrived, Prince was a global operator with a footprint in the Middle East and Africa, but he remained in exile from the center of power in Washington, D.C. That changed with the disruption of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The rise of Donald Trump offered Prince a path to redemption. The Trump campaign was anti-establishment, transactional, and deeply suspicious of the deep state bureaucracy that Prince blamed for his downfall. Furthermore, Prince had a direct line to the candidate. His sister, Betsy DeVos, was a billionaire Republican megadonor. Prince went all in on Trump. He donated $250,000 to the campaign and related super PACs, but his contribution went far beyond money. He offered himself as a shadow advisor on national security. He used his appearances on Breitbart News Radio, run by Steve Bannon, to attack the Clinton, Bush, and Obama foreign policy establishments, positioning himself as the outsider who knew how to win the wars the generals were losing. As the election approached, Prince became involved in the campaign's most secretive and controversial maneuvers. In August 2016, months before the vote, Prince secured a meeting at Trump Tower with Donald Trump Jr., George Nader, an emissary for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and Joel Zamel, an Israeli social media manipulation expert. The topic, according to later investigations, was foreign assistance for the Trump campaign. Prince was acting as the bridge between the campaign and the Gulf monarchies. He had served in exile. But Prince's most mysterious act occurred after the election, during the transition period. In January 2017, just days before Trump's inauguration, Eric Prince flew to the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. There, in a secluded luxury hotel, he held a secret meeting with a Russian fund manager named Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, and a man with a direct line to Vladimir Putin. The purpose of this meeting remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Trump era. Prince would later testify to Congress that it was a chance encounter over a beer, but the Mueller report would later conclude that the meeting had been set up in advance by the UAE to establish a back-channel communication line between the incoming Trump White House and the Kremlin, bypassing the U.S. State Department. When Trump took office in January 2017, the Prince family was triumphant. Betsy DeVos was confirmed as Secretary of Education, placing a Prince family member in the cabinet. Eric Prince, though he had no official role, was suddenly an insider again. He was seen visiting the White House and advising Steve Bannon. The exile was over. The Merchant of Death was back in the Capitol, and he had a new radical plan to sell to the president. He wanted to privatize the longest war in American history, Afghanistan. By the summer of 2017, Eric Prince was operating with a level of access and audacity that he had not enjoyed since the early days of the Iraq occupation. With his sister Betsy DeVos installed in the cabinet and his allies Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner in the West Wing, Prince launched a public and private lobbying campaign to fundamentally restructure American foreign policy. His target was the longest war in American history, Afghanistan. For 16 years, the United States military had been bogged down in a stalemate against the Taliban, spending nearly $45 billion a year with little to show for it. President Trump, transactional by nature and deeply skeptical of his generals, was furious at the lack of progress. Into this frustration, Erik Prince inserted a radical solution. He published op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and appeared on cable news pitching a plan that would have effectively privatized the entire war. Prince proposed withdrawing almost all American troops and replacing them with a private force of 6,000 mercenaries, whom he politely termed contractors, and a private air force. These men would be recruited from the special forces of allied nations, paid by the U.S. government, but commanded by a viceroy, a single, all-powerful American figure who would report directly to the president, bypassing the Pentagon bureaucracy. Prince was explicit about his historical model. He did not cite modern peacekeeping doctrine. He cited the British East India Company. He argued that the corporate colonial model of the 18th century, where a private company ruled India for profit, was the only way to stabilize Afghanistan. He claimed he could do the job for $10 billion a year, saving the American taxpayer over $30 billion annually. He promised to use lighter, cheaper, faster air power, likely his weaponized crop dusters, to crush the Taliban and secure the country's vast mineral wealth, including lithium and gold, which could then be extracted by Western companies to pay for the war. The proposal was met with horror by the U.S. national security establishment. Defense Secretary James Mattis and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster viewed the idea as an abomination. They argued that handing over the sovereign power of war to a private CEO would undermine American moral authority, violate international law, and likely lead to massacres. They saw it as a mercenary army that would answer only to profit. But Prince had the president's ear. In a tense meeting in the Oval Office in the summer of 2017, Trump reportedly waved Prince's charts at his generals, demanding to know why the private sector could do it cheaper. Although Mattis eventually managed to kill the plan, the fact that it was considered at the highest level of the U.S. government demonstrated how far the norms of warfare had shifted. Erik Prince had successfully normalized the idea that a national war could be treated as a corporate turnaround project. While Prince was failing to buy the war in Afghanistan, he was engaging in a dark Black Ops campaign on American soil that would remain hidden for years. The merchant of death was becoming a merchant of spies. During the Trump years, specifically from 2016 to 2018, investigative reporting by the New York Times and The Intercept revealed that Erik Prince was recruiting former American and British spies to run domestic intelligence operations against perceived political enemies of Donald Trump. Operating from a ranch in Wyoming and his offices in Virginia, Prince allegedly helped train and fund operatives for Project Veritas, a right-wing group known for its deceptive sting operations against media organizations and liberal groups. But Prince's involvement went deeper. Reports surfaced that he had recruited an ex-MI6 officer named Richard Seddon to train undercover operatives in the art of espionage. These operatives were then deployed to infiltrate the American Federation of Teachers in Michigan and various Democratic congressional campaigns. This was a profound crossing of the line. Prince was applying the tactics of the CYA, surveillance, infiltration, human intelligence, against American citizens on American soil. It was the privatization of political espionage. But the most spectacular failure of this period, and the one that exposed the limits of his private war model, was the Project Opus disaster in Libya. In April 2019, the United Nations was trying to hold together a fragile peace in Libya. a country torn by civil war between the UN-recognized government in Tripoli and the forces of the warlord Khalifa Haftar in the east. There was a strict UN arms embargo in place, prohibiting any foreign power from sending weapons or mercenaries into the conflict. Erik Prince saw the embargo not as a law, but as a market opportunity. According to a confidential UN report later leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post, Prince allegedly pitched a plan to Khalifa Haftar to help him conquer Tripoli and seize control of the country. The plan, codenamed Project Opus, was a classic mercenary raid. Prince allegedly offered to provide Haftar with a hit team of Western mercenaries, attack helicopters, and surveillance aircraft to decapitate the Tripoli government. The price tag was reportedly $80 million. In June 2019, the operation was launched. A team of 20 mercenaries, mostly British, Australian, and South African, arrived in Benghazi. They had procured assault rifles and military gear. Simultaneously, Prince's associates allegedly arranged for the purchase of 3 military-grade helicopters from Jordan and South Africa, which were to be flown into Libya to provide air support. But the operation descended into a farce. When the mercenaries arrived, they found that General Haftar was unimpressed with their equipment. He had expected top-tier American gunships. Instead, he got refurbished, older helicopters. An argument ensued. Haftar, a volatile warlord, reportedly threatened the mercenaries. Realizing they were in danger not from the enemy, but from their own client, the mercenary team panicked. In a scene reminiscent of a bad spy novel, the 20 mercenaries fled Benghazi in the middle of the night on June 29, 2019. They boarded 2 rigid hull inflatable boats, RHIBS, and made a desperate 350-mile run across the Mediterranean Sea to the safety of Malta. When they arrived in Malta, they were detained by authorities. The cover story fell apart. UN investigators seized their laptops and documents. They found the paper trail. It led back to companies associated with Erik Prince. The Project Opus disaster was a violation of international law on a massive scale. It was a private citizen attempting to overthrow a UN-recognized government using an illegal mercenary force. It exposed Prince to potential criminal liability for violating the UN arms embargo. But back in Washington, Prince remained insulated. The Trump administration, specifically the National Security Council, showed zero interest in investigating the brother of the Secretary of Education. However, the domestic legal pressure was mounting on a different front. The Mueller investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election had taken a hard look at the Seychelles meeting. When Robert Mueller's team interviewed Erik Prince, Prince stuck to his story. The meeting with the Russian fund manager Kirill Dmitriev was a coincidence, a chance encounter over a beer. But Mueller found evidence to the contrary. The special counsel obtained text messages and testimony from George Nader, the fixer who had arranged the meeting. Nader testified that the meeting was set up weeks in advance specifically to establish a back channel between Trump and Putin. The Mueller report, released in April 2019, laid out these inconsistencies in black and white. It strongly suggested that Erik Prince had lied to Congress and to federal investigators. In a functional legal system, this would be perjury, a felony. The House Intelligence Committee sent a criminal referral to the Department of Justice, urging them to prosecute Prince for lying to Congress. But the Department of Justice in 2019 and 2020 was run by William Barr, a staunch Trump loyalist. The referral died on the vine. Prince was never charged. Once again, his proximity to power and the Prince family halo had saved him. As 2020 arrived, the final year of the Trump presidency, Erik Prince was operating in a strange limbo. He was a global celebrity in the underworld of private warfare, a man who could get a meeting with almost any dictator or warlord on earth. He was under investigation by the UN and referred for prosecution by Congress, yet he was free to travel the world on his private jet. But he had one piece of unfinished business from the old days. The men of Raven 23, the Blackwater Guards who had committed the Nisour Square massacre in 2007, were sitting in federal prison. Nicholas Slatton was serving a life sentence for murder. Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurd were serving lengthy terms for manslaughter. Prince had always maintained that these men were heroes, political prisoners sacrificed by a liberal establishment to appease Iraq. He began a quiet, intense lobbying campaign directed at one man, President Donald Trump. Prince knew that Trump possessed the one power that could override the FBI, the DOJ, the judges, and the juries, the presidential pardon. He played to Trump's instincts. He framed the Blackwater Guards as victims of a rigged system, soldiers who were being punished for doing their job in a tough neighborhood. He leveraged his family's massive donations. He leveraged his loyalty. In the chaotic final days of the Trump administration, as the president issued a flurry of pardons to his political allies, Erik Prince waited. He had built an army, fought a war, ignored the law, and survived every scandal. Now, he wanted total exoneration. While Erik Prince was navigating the fallout of the Mueller investigation and lobbying for pardons in Washington, he was simultaneously engaged in one of the most audacious geopolitical gambles of his career in South America. Throughout 2019 and early 2020, as the Trump administration ramped up its maximum pressure campaign against the socialist regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Prince saw an opening that was perfectly suited to his specific set of skills. The U.S. government had recognized the opposition leader Juan Guaido as the legitimate president, but Maduro refused to step down, protected by the Venezuelan military. The diplomatic track was stalled. Prince proposed a kinetic solution. Operating from his network of safe houses and offices in Virginia and London, Prince developed a battle plan labeled Dynamic. It was, in essence, a privatized invasion of a sovereign nation. Prince proposed raising a private army of 5,000 mercenaries to break the stalemate. His recruitment strategy was specific and politically savvy. He would not use Americans, which would trigger a War Powers Act crisis. Instead, he planned to recruit Peruvians, Colombians, and other Latin American soldiers who had fled the chaos of the region. These men would be organized into stabilization units, armed with Western weaponry, and deployed to seize key strategic assets in Venezuela: the oil fields, the power grid, and the presidential palace. Prince shopped this plan with the fervor of a startup founder seeking venture capital. He held secret meetings in Miami and Washington with wealthy Venezuelan exiles, promising them that for $40 million in seed money, he could initiate the operation. He pitched the idea to State Department officials and members of the National Security Council. His argument was that the U.S. military was too risk-averse to intervene directly, and that the CIA was hamstrung by bureaucracy. A private force, he argued, could act as a deniable asset, creating a fait accompli on the ground that would allow Guaido to take power. The audacity of the dynamic plan cannot be overstated. Prince was effectively trying to resurrect the filibuster, the 19th century practice of private American citizens launching unauthorized military expeditions to conquer Latin American territories. While the Trump administration ultimately declined to officially endorse the plan, with officials privately describing it as fantasy and dangerous. The mere fact that Prince was able to pitch a private invasion of a major oil-producing nation at the highest levels of government demonstrated the total erosion of norms during this era. It proved that Prince viewed the sovereign borders of nations not as lines on a map, but as barriers to entry in a market he intended to disrupt. By 2020, Prince's shadow war had fully migrated to American soil. Building on the domestic intelligence network he had established years earlier with former MI6 officer Richard Seddon, an operation that had already targeted labor unions and Democratic campaigns, Prince ramped up his efforts as the election approached. He viewed the political left not just as opponents, but as enemy combatants, and he was determined to apply the same counterinsurgency tactics used in Baghdad to the battleground of American politics. As the 2020 election approached, the pressure on Prince intensified. The various investigations into his conduct, the UN probe into the Libya raid, the FBI investigation into arms trafficking, and the congressional inquiries into his Seychelles testimony were converging. He knew that if Donald Trump lost the election, the protective shield of the Justice Department, then led by Bill Barr, would vanish. A Biden Department of Justice would likely reopen the files on Project Opus and the perjury allegations regarding the Mueller probe. This looming deadline drove Prince's frantic activity in the final months of 2020. He was not just fighting for his business, he was fighting for his liberty. His lobbying for the pardons of the Raven 23 shooters was part of a broader strategy to delegitimize the entire legal apparatus that had pursued him for a decade. By convincing Trump to pardon the men of Nisour Square, Prince was effectively getting the President of the United States to declare that the prosecutions were a sham, a witch hunt, orchestrated by the anti-war left. It was a preemptive strike against any future attempt to prosecute Prince himself. In the chaotic transition period of late 2020 and early January 2021, as the Trump presidency collapsed into the violence of January 6th, Prince remained a shadow player. While he was not publicly at the Capitol, his ideology, the belief in righteous violence, the distrust of institutions, and the idea that patriots must take matters into their own hands was the spiritual engine of the insurrection. The paramilitary aesthetic of the rioters, the tactical gear, the oath keepers moving in stacks, this was the culture Eric Prince had helped to mainstream. He had spent 20 years selling the idea that the government was broken and that armed private citizens were the only true guardians of the Republic. On January 6th, that idea came home to roost. The Trump era ended for Prince not with a bang, but with a quiet, successful escape. He had survived the Mueller investigation without an indictment. He had survived the UN Libya probe without an arrest warrant. He had secured the freedom of his men, and he had rebuilt his fortune through logistics contracts in Africa and security deals in the Middle East. He emerged from the most turbulent decade of his life with his liberty intact, his bank accounts full, and his philosophy vindicated by the chaos of the world. The Merchant of Death had proven that in the modern era, you didn't need to win the war to win the game. You just needed to survive the peace. Did the Merchant of Death win the long game? On the evening of December 22, 2020, just weeks before he was set to leave the White House, President Donald Trump delivered the final definitive victory for the Prince family dynasty. In a flurry of executive clemency grants announced just before Christmas, the president issued full unconditional pardons for Nicholas Slatton, Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurd, the 4 Blackwater contractors convicted of the slaughter at Nisour Square. The reaction in the United States was a mix of shock and partisan shrugs, but in Iraq, it was received as a final devastating national humiliation. For 13 years, the families of the 17 dead civilians, including the father of Ahmed Haytham, the medical student killed in the white Kia, had clung to the convictions as the only shred of justice they had ever received from the American system. The pardons obliterated that justice with the stroke of a pen. The White House statement justifying the decision, which Erik Prince had lobbied for intensely, described the men not as child killers, but as veterans with a long history of service to the nation. It completely bypassed the findings of the FBI, the grand juries, and the federal judges who had overseen the years-long legal process. For Erik Prince, the pardons were the ultimate vindication. They were the closing of the circle. He had founded Blackwater on the premise that private warriors were superior to public soldiers, and that they deserved special protection. By securing their freedom, he had proven that the rules of the state did not apply to his men. He had demonstrated that with enough money, enough political leverage, and the right family connections, accountability was optional. The 4 men walked free from federal prison, their life sentences erased as if the massacre had never happened. But the legacy of Blackwater did not end with the pardons. In the years following the Trump presidency 2021 to 2024, Erik Prince did not retreat into a quiet retirement. Instead, he reinvented himself yet again, this time as a media personality and a tech entrepreneur, positioning himself as the elder statesman of the global far right. Prince launched a podcast titled Off Leash, a name that seemed to be a deliberate, trolling nod to the criticism of his Wolfpack era. On the show, he railed against the woke U.S. military, advocated for a colonial approach to foreign policy, and continued to pitch his services to the world. He became a fixture on the conservative speaking circuit, warning of the collapse of Western civilization and offering hard solutions. His newest business venture, launched in 2022, was a pivot from kinetics to cyber. He founded Unplugged, a smartphone company promising military-grade encryption and total privacy from big tech and government surveillance. It was a product perfectly tailored for his new audience: paranoid libertarians, survivalists, and political dissidents who believed the deep state was watching them. The man who had once sought to build the CIA's surveillance network was now selling the tools to defeat it. However, the true legacy of the Prince family is not found in a podcast or a phone. It is found on the battlefields of Ukraine, Africa, and the Middle East. Erik Prince won the ideological argument. When he started Blackwater in 1997, the idea of a private army fighting a sovereign war was considered an anachronism, a relic of the colonial era. Today it is the global standard. The most terrifying validation of the Blackwater model came from America's greatest adversary, Russia. The Wagner Group, the Russian private military company led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, until his death in 2023, was a near-perfect mirror image of Blackwater. Like Prince, Prigozhin was a businessman with deep ties to the state but no official position. Like Blackwater, Wagner operated in the gray zone, allowing the Kremlin to project power in Syria and Africa while maintaining plausible deniability. Like Blackwater, Wagner was accused of war crimes and massacres. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the similarities became undeniable. Erik Prince publicly commented on the war, arguing with characteristic audacity that if the Biden administration had allowed him to send his Air Force to Ukraine in 2021, he could have deterred the Russian invasion. He framed the conflict as a failure of conventional deterrence and a missed opportunity for privatization. While his offer was ignored, the reality on the ground proved that the age of the mercenary had fully arrived. Both sides in modern conflicts now routinely rely on contractors for logistics, intelligence, and combat support. The monopoly on violence that nation-states had jealously guarded for centuries has been permanently fractured. The normalization of the private military company, PMC, is the Prince family's enduring gift to the world. Before Blackwater, war was the solemn duty of the citizen soldier. After Blackwater, war became a service sector. Prince proved that you could float a mercenary army on the stock market, rebrand it when the PR got bad, and walk away rich even when the mission failed. He transformed the moral hazard of war into a business model. As of 2024, Erik Prince remains a free man, a billionaire, and an influential voice in global politics. He travels between London, Abu Dhabi, and the United States, pitching new ideas for border control in the U.S. and resource security in Africa. His sister, Betsy DeVos, remains a kingmaker in Republican politics. The family fortune, born in a garage in Michigan making car parts, has successfully laundered itself through the blood of the Middle East and emerged clean on the other side. The story of the Prince family is ultimately a story about the privatization of the American dream. Edgar Prince believed that private enterprise could build a better sun visor. His son believed that private enterprise could build a better war. The tragedy is not just that Erik Prince failed to deliver security. It is that he succeeded in destroying the idea that some things, like justice, accountability, and the power to kill, should never be for sale. The Shadow Army has not disbanded. It has simply metastasized, becoming the invisible architecture of a world where the only law is the contract, and the only crime is not getting paid. The ultimate consequence of the Blackwater saga is not just the normalization of mercenaries abroad, but the subtle creeping privatization of security at home. The boomerang effect, a concept often cited by political scientists where tactics used in foreign wars eventually return to the domestic front, has been fully realized in the career of Erik Prince. The militarized police forces that patrolled American cities during the civil unrest of 2020, equipped with armored personnel carriers and tactical gear indistinguishable from those used in Baghdad, are the spiritual descendants of the Blackwater ethos. Prince sold the idea that security is a commodity to be purchased, rather than a public good to be guaranteed. In doing so, he helped erode the social contract. When wealthy neighborhoods in Los Angeles or New York hire private security details that look and act like special forces units, they are participating in the fragmentation of the state that Prince predicted and profited from. Furthermore, the brain drain that Blackwater initiated has permanently altered the United States military. For 20 years, the promise of a Blackwater paycheck, 3 or 4 times the salary of an active duty soldier, has lured thousands of the most highly trained special operations forces out of the military and into the private sector. This hollowing out of the elite ranks has created a dependency loop. The military loses its best men to the private sector, and then has to hire the private sector to do the jobs those men used to do. The taxpayer pays twice, once to train the SEAL or Green Beret, and again to hire him back as a contractor at a premium rate. Erik Prince did not just build a private army. He privatized the most valuable human capital of the Pentagon. As the narrative of the Prince family concludes, it stands as a stark monument to the transformation of American power in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Edgar Prince, the patriarch, represented the industrial age. He built physical things, created jobs in his community, and believed in a rigid, if controversial, moral order. His son, Erik Prince, represents the post-industrial age. He builds networks, extracts value from chaos, and operates in a moral vacuum where the only imperative is the mission. The family fortune has transitioned from the tangible production of automotive parts to the intangible, violent service of global instability. The story of Blackwater is, in the final analysis, a tragedy of accountability. It revealed that the legal institutions of the United States, the Department of Justice, the Congress, the courts, are woefully ill-equipped to restrain a transnational entity that operates in the seams of the map. Eric Prince proved that a determined individual armed with enough wealth and political connection can effectively secede from the legal constraints that bind ordinary citizens. He can run a private foreign policy, influence elections, and wage private wars, all while retaining his liberty and his fortune. In the history books of the future, the name Blackwater will likely appear not as an aberration, but as a pioneer. Just as the Dutch East India Company presaged the British Empire, Blackwater presaged the era of corporate warfare that now defines the 21st century. Eric Prince, the man who wanted to be a crusader, ended up being a prophet of a darker, more fractured world, a world where the flag you fight for matters less than the company that signs your check. The legacy of the Prince family is a world where war is no longer politics by other means, but simply a business transaction, and business is always open.